Thank you all so much for being here for our wonderful panel today on mixing, the subtle art. And I want to start by thanking Alexa Borden, our AWFC Communications Director, for running tech today. Huge help. And I'm also going to introduce our wonderful host of today's panel, Mandy Hoffman, also a board member. And I'm just going to let you take it away. Very excited for this. And thank you all for being here. I already said that. Whoops.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm really excited to talk with Andrea Roberts and Lori Castro. They're both phenomenal, know their shit, mixers. And I think all of us know that mixing is an art and not a science. And it's something that we're constantly having to work on for our entire lives. Andrea is a Grammy-nominated recording engineer and mixer based in LA, and she's worked with the likes of Beyonce and Linda Perry, and Lori Castro has worked on multiple Oscar and Grammy projects, and she also lives in Los Angeles and has come from the Hans Zimmer camp at some point, which we can talk about. And we just can't wait to pick your brains. If you guys want to tell us a little bit more about yourselves. Lori, you want to start?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I started off on the record side of the world. So I worked with Sylvia Massey. I don't know if anyone here has heard of her, but one of my idols. And then I was very lucky that she became my mentor. So I worked with her for a very long time, just learning the 70s style recording to tape with analog consoles, and just having her help me navigate the world of making records, which is what I originally wanted to start in. And then at some point I got really curious about surround sound mixing, something that a lot of folks weren't doing at the time. So decided to move to LA. I know this all sounds really simple, but there's a lot of struggle in between. I didn't just show up to LA. At some point I ended up landing a job at Hans Zimmer studio, where they told me I probably wouldn't last the first week. But luckily I lasted there a couple of years. And I learned a lot, not just with film score, production, but mixing as well, working next to Alan Meyerson, specifically becoming his main assistant for a while. He was also my mentor. And then I moved to Steve Jablonski. He asked me to run his studio and run all the microphones and cabling and all the above. So that was really cool. And then now I'm freelance, but I also work alongside Netflix. They hired me to be their consultant for a lot of the mix spaces and audio related stuff.
So cool. Thank you. Andrea, let's hear about your journey.
Yeah. First of all, just really grateful to be here today. Thank you for bringing me in. I'm really excited to share, our experience, and if we have any little bits of wisdom that can help somebody, I'm really happy to be here. I started out as a musician way before I got into engineering or knew that I was interested in engineering. So I studied piano. I was basically just a gigging piano player for years, but I was always the person in the band that was interested in recording the rehearsals or tried to record our performances. And so I was drawn to that, but I was frustrated with it for years because I didn't really have anyone to ask questions to. I remember getting this little recorder and it came with Nuendo, and I tried to get it on my computer and I couldn't figure it out. And I just was like so frustrated. And years later, I just realized no, I'm really into this. And I realized I didn't want to be a gigging musician professionally for the rest of my life. And I was living in Argentina at the time and I actually studied audio down there. And there weren't a lot of professional studios where I was living at the time. And I just decided to make the move to LA, if I was going to really pursue this professionally. And I felt like I was kind of transitioning later in life. So I was 30 years old trying to get an unpaid internship in Los Angeles. And I did that whole thing. I moved up to runner to assistant engineer to engineer. And, at that studio made connections with different artists, different labels. And that's, eventually, it was actually because of COVID that kind of pushed me into freelance work, maybe sooner than I thought I was ready for. But silver lining for me of that whole experience was it kind of pushed me into this next phase of my career where I'm in now. And also, so I also came from the record side like Lori, and somebody approached me about mixing something for movie, and I had no idea about that kind of mixing, and reaching out to someone, I got connected with Lori, and she said, come on by the studio. She was working for Steve at the time, and through her, I've been able to, do some work for Steve's team as well. And so I'm kind of on both sides at this point, the record side and the film
You're
world.
like, I'm a badass, no big deal.
So are you guys, thank you for sharing that, by the way. Are you guys working mostly in mixing or recording these days? Or is it both?
I do both. To me, I've never felt a difference in my journey. I think like, Andrea, we kind of have that same starting point. Mine was a boombox, right? I feel like I'm old now talking about boombox. So I think like my whole life, I've never really split the two. I feel like they're so interleaved. In film score mixing, though, I feel like there is a defined difference, at least with some of the more seasoned mixers who've been around since before I was born. There's like a strict difference of mixer and an engineer and somewhere in between sometimes. But yeah, I'm both.
You mean that there's like a strict difference in different people do different jobs and they kind of stick to that one job?
Yeah, maybe a lot of it has to do with the union as well. And on the record side, there's not too much union talk.
Right.
So there's a lot of hat swapping, and you just kind of have to know when to put on that new hat in that moment. And then with film score, there's a lot of more like, this is the job I do, and I get it from my chair if I have to edit drums or tune vocals kind of thing. But yeah, I think with my journey too, I just rise to the occasion. When you're doing records with folks, when somebody has a scratch vocal, sometimes they want to tune it real quick because it's jarring the person doing an overdub, and it's just kind of jumping into that seat, I guess. I don't know. How about you, Andrea?
So my audio cut out during the question. Could you repeat the question for me?
I guess the question was, are you finding yourself doing more recording or more mixing these days, or is it both? And yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I find now that I'm not working full-time at a commercial recording studio, I'm doing less recording than I was before, probably. It's more, I'd say more mixing for me, but to Lori's point, they're interchangeable in a lot of ways. The lines are blurred between the two these days, I think.
Well, I think that's a good segue into my first question, which is so often we rely on these remote recordings these days. And as a mixer, what kind of challenges do you face receiving sessions that you didn't engineer? And
yeah, it's a good question. I feel like a lot of folks and other companies don't realize that remote recording has been around since well before COVID. When we talk about like orchestral recordings too overseas, a lot of that had been happening at least well before COVID for me as well, having to set up Source Connect sessions and call folks at Abbey Road, call folks in Bratislava and connect with them on their time. Even as a mixer, I'd asked to speak with the scoring session team to talk about like how they're going to even set up their template, because that affects, the domino effect downstream, upstream, however you want to see it. So even sending them my template of how I want tracks labeled, or how I'd like to see some of the, sectioning off of if there's overdubs. So for me, it's getting ahead of it as much as I can. And that's if I have a composer that really wants me involved that much. Some of them, maybe the budget's really slim, or maybe they're doing their own overdubs. In that case, I try to emphasize that, if I'm being brought on as a mixer and not a recorder, if I can be in strict communication with them just to kind of see, how things are building and get my ears around the content, so that by the time it gets to me, I have more of an idea of how my template's going to look and what the goal is, I guess. And I think that's been beneficial, because if it's a composer recording overdubs in their personal space, I'm able to catch some acoustic issues or phasing issues ahead of time. I'll even say, hey, I know you have like a really cool overdub session happening, not a lot of space, but if you can send me like one stereo recorded file, like one audio clip, so I can hear it back in my studio, and then I can tell you if there's any phase issues and stuff ahead of time, so at least we can nip that in the bud before they crank out like many cues with that same thing, same sound.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it sounds like communication is just important from the get-go if you can.
Yeah.
How about you, Andrea? Have you?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of those thoughts. Yeah, always, if possible, like Lori said, sending an example of like, hey, this is the setup, this is kind of the sound. Is there any feedback? Again, before I spend a whole day recording 50 takes or whatever. And also, I feel like I think maybe we've talked about this, Lori, where somebody might find halfway through, oh, I'm realize that there's this phase issue or this or that, and they want to kind of fix it halfway through.
We're
sometimes,
like, no.
Sometimes like, no, don't fix it, because I figured out in the first 10 takes how to fix it, and that's in my chain now. And so if you try to fix it from the recording side, that's going to mess up. So again, it comes back to communication, right? If you're a composer and you say, oh no, I realized that this wasn't placed properly or this or that, and you want to get ahead of it, just call your mixer first before you change anything. Communication can really, like you
don't
said,
fix it in the mix.
Don't fix it and then without communicating that you did.
Yeah. And I think, we have talked about this, and it saves you money. Like for a lot of mixers, I know for myself, if I get a session in from somebody, that's happened a lot to me, where someone says, I had someone else mix it, I didn't, either they fell through or they got consumed in another project, can you take it from here? So I wasn't even around during the creative process or the recording process, so I'm just kind of handed these files, and I just kind of have to, I feel like Sherlock Holmes, I'm just trying to figure out where the bones are buried, and I try to start from scratch. I don't want whatever the mixer plugins were and stuff. I just want to hear the raw files before they started putting on their sauce and spice on top of it. So for me, there's no straight answer. I think it's just realizing, okay, I'm working with something that maybe I didn't touch, I didn't record. I might even ask the composer, did the mixer flag to you anything? Because some mixers don't. I'm guilty of it too, where if it's a really quick mix, maybe it's a demo or something, if I catch problems, I maybe don't have time to email the composer a whole, essay of, here are the things I found wrong, and maybe you should check this.
Right.
But I think that communication, again, with the composer, even after the fact, saying, hey, let's kind of recap on some stuff that I found in the mix that I really want to address. Also, you don't want them to spiral. Let's be honest. We've worked with composers even higher up that can spiral if you flag some things out, when you can just fix it and then talk about it after the stuff's been shipped to the dub stage. So I think, I like to go back, especially with up and coming composers or composers that don't really have their sound dialed in. I like to kind of meet with them with coffee and just say, okay, here's some things that I found, like your piano. I remember one composer had a piano sound that one of the mics was just out of phase the whole time. And it does take time. It eats that time to kind of troubleshoot and make sure, okay, am I crazy? Or let me just check everything. But being able to talk with her and say, hey, let me come to your place. If this is the kind of miking you're going to be using for all of, most of your, pieces, let's get into it. Let's listen to the mics in your room. Let's look at acoustic treatment. Let's try to get to the bottom of it. So the next project, you're that much faster. And now you shaved off a couple days,
Right, because you charge per day, I'm guessing, right?
It depends. It depends on the budget. Some people have, the package deal, which, we all love that. But I think, it depends on the budget. And again, I guess you really want your mixer to spend more time mixing, just like how composers want to spend more time writing. They don't want to be fidgeting with, why is my speaker this and why does this not work? And you just ate up that cognitive load, that the space that was allocated to your creative flow, right? And that's why a lot of my bread and butter has been called by composers, and you too, which is, can you come fix my stuff so I can just not deal with this and I can get back to writing? So it's the same thing for mixers get in the flow. I know, if I know I have to mix a certain amount of music, if I look at the cue sheet, I talk to the music editor about what reel they're going to go up with at the dub stage first. That's also a big communicator. Your music editor, you have to have a really good music editor, because they really steer the ship for not just the composer but the mixer.
Right.
I'm able to then allocate my day of, okay, I know that I got to eat breakfast, coffee, and lock this down for the next 4 to 5 hours. But if I have to break my flow because, like, she was saying somebody fixed something midway, didn't tell me, now I'm eating up time of, using isotope, checking phase, making sure that I didn't miss it on the previous 4 cues. It's a domino effect.
And are you mostly working with composers in the room with you while you're mixing, or do you sometimes do it remotely as well?
Yeah, the bulk of it is remotely at first. So the bulk of
Okay.
it is me getting the files, sometimes well before the mix official start date. I
Right.
just ask for the files. I want to hear 2 mixes. I reach out to the music editor. A lot of music editors have the 2 mixes in their sessions already, so that they can just send me the 2 mixes that they're creating in their Pro Tool sessions as well, just so I can wrap my head around again what kind of instruments. I get classic notepad and I start writing all the instruments I'm hearing to start my stem layout, which is another thing that's really important. Stem layout for me for mixers. I want to see all the food categories that I'm gonna get. I normally ask for like the biggest cue. Like, what is your widest cue real estate wise for instruments? What's the cue that you're throwing all your samples? I want to see it all so that I can, have that wiggle room, and then I can always shave some down once I get to the other cues, if that makes sense. It's just kind of planning what your session's going to look like. So by the time the composer starts to send me those late night print sessions, I can start funneling into a template that I sort of already have laid out, knowing that they're going to have a bunch of high perk. There's some sessions I've gotten where there's not a lot of low end. It's like kind of like your documentary style stuff. So
Right.
now I know to allocate so much time to LFE or sub or anything like that. So this is all the boring stuff that, puts people to sleep when I talk about it. But as a composer, that really saves you time. It saves a
Yeah.
mixer so much productivity time to just get in the flow of the mix. And it helps us really prepare beforehand, because a lot of us are preparing before that downbeat day of mix. We are really trying to get our template dialed in.
So, I mean, this kind of, God, you just answered like little bits of all these questions I have. So when you're setting up this template, which you're going to have like one project template, basically, because ideally there's a universal sound to whatever score you're working with. And then you're building this template off of stems that you're receiving from the composer or from the recording stage. Say it was
Sometimes.
overseas. Okay.
Yeah, sometimes if it's yes and no. So sometimes, like if I'm working on a Transformer movie type thing, there's no secret about it. There's like 6 composers writing for that thing, right? There's never
Right.
one. I mean, the secret's out. There's not one composer writing it. So I'm actually going to each composer or additional writer or whatever the politically additional programmer is the word we use, right? I reach out to all of them and I get a list of all the composers that are going to be sending me cues. I talk to their assistant and I say, I need at least 2 mixes if you don't have stems yet. I understand you can't print stems. Some people are literally approving cues at the final hour. So I just need, if you have 2 mixes, I need to get them so that I can at least hear the cue and start audibly hearing what's in there. Is there live orchestra? Is this just a transitional cue? Is this just something that's, I can hear if there's an attempt for future live orchestra, possibly. Then the music editor helps tell me what cues have been recorded with live musicians or orchestra. So at least I can plan for those cues to have that part of the template in it. So there's a lot of moving around. Some projects, some composers only do the action cues, and some projects they have an additional writer only do like the more emotionally, more aerial sounding stuff. So now I have 2 different templates. I have a template for the composer doing all the stuff that's ripping your face off, and the composer that's making everyone feel warm and fuzzy. Those are 2 different templates. So it's a lot of strategy. I've been fortunate to work with some of the craziest projects with other composers. So I guess mine is a bit more extreme rather than someone who's maybe doing a documentary where it's a bit more, across the board, it's going to be a solid sound, not too many, Michael Bay-ish moments, so there's different flavors. It just depends. Again, what's going to tell me everything I need to know is if I can get those 2 mixes, whether they're embarrassed to show me or not, or whether they're polished or not. I just need to hear it so that I can start preemptively, just start planning out what I need to be prepared for. It helps.
And these two mixes, so these would be your reference, right? This is what you
Yes.
would call your reference track, because we discussed earlier, sometimes people call reference tracks what you want the mix to sound like, but in your case, you're calling reference tracks a rough mix that somebody has put together for the music.
Yeah, picture your reference track is the track you send when you get a music editor. The music editor is not going to want your full stems right away. They just want the 2 mix so they can slap it in to the AE, and then a director somewhere can say yes or no, or they don't say anything at all, which what in the business, no news is good news. I guess they approved it. They didn't wink at me and point at something. So more than likely the ref that we're talking about is what your stems equal. If you were to mute your stems and play back that track, that stereo mix, and I say stereo because a lot of composers write in stereo. You have some that maybe write in quad or 5/1, but for the most part, the higher up, the Hans Zimmers and stuff, they write in stereo. So that's what we're referencing as the ref track, the stereo mix.
And then you'll take that reference track and try to recreate like a better version of it, basically.
Yeah, I love that. It's simple. Yeah. I mean, I come from the record world where I'm used to putting so much elbow grease into a mix. It's not just, oh, you have a ref track, so let me just match it and make it bigger. It's, oh,
Right.
I got to tune vocals. Oh, I got to resample your drum kit because somebody didn't pay attention to the snare, snare mic fell. Or someone's like a Paramore sound, which their drum kit sound is amazing. So now I got to go and enhance what someone else recorded with samples, and that takes days. Or I have to edit drums, or I have to comp vocals. That's a whole other like nitty gritty, get your sleeves rolled up kind of situation. In the film score world, again, and from what I've seen, there's been a very deliberate, dividing of jobs. Normally the person editing the drums, if there's anyone there to edit it, is the person editing orchestra and comping it. It's normally an assistant or a composer assistant. And then by the time the mixer comes in, a film score mixer, they're literally moving faders up and down. Not too many mixers that I've sat next to tune vocals, or, it gets offloaded to someone else. Yeah. Yes, film score mixing is to make it bigger.
Yeah. Would this be a helpful moment to show that visual?
Okay. Sure. Let's
talking
share
about
visual.
our.
Yeah, it's a great picture.
Perfect.
Of what we're talking about there.
Right. So this would be just as like,
tell us what we're looking at. Yeah.
We're looking at if your mixer asks you to send stems, right, to mix, this would be a session that I would like to receive. So
yeah,
like it's organized like this. This was an example of something that I had worked on. I changed some of the names. So, you see AR, I just put my initials. That would be like the name of your project, whatever code name you have for your project. The name of the cue, the number 1M24 in this case, example would be the name of the cue, time code, and then what version, make sure the version on your stems matches your ref mix. So up at the top, the purple, that's what we're talking about earlier of the ref mix. That's the 2-track that maybe the music editor has been working with. This is what got approved. This is the mix. This is the mix that's approved. So all of the stems, all the yellow stems below should equal that ref mix. So the first thing that I would do, and often as an assistant working for mixers, this is the first job. You get this and you A/B it. Listen through, and you can see the ref mix is muted. So you would, have all of the tracks selected, and you go back and forth, muting and unmuting both the ref and the stems and make sure they match exactly. That's your first step. And I think people might be shocked at how often they do not match.
Yeah. Honestly, I would say this is where it all starts, right?
This is where it all starts. Yeah.
And I want to highlight that this should be what the composer assistants, if you have one, if you're lucky enough to have an assistant, if not, it's you, unfortunately. This is, that's supposed to be where it gets caught. And by it gets caught is when you're A-being stems against this ref purple track. If you're hearing missing sounds, you got to do a reprint, you got to troubleshoot, because if your mixer does it, I think we've both seen mixers that we've assisted just waste days on this. because they're also waiting
Mhm.
for a reprint, right? They can't mix,
Yeah.
they can't get to mixing if there's not a reprint. But yeah.
So the reason why it's sounding different is because possibly a stem is missing, or you're just
Mhm.
saying they just put some effect on the master mix. I mean, I've seen people do
Yes.
that before where they'll put some kind of master effect on the track, but
Yeah.
not on the stems, which,
Yeah.
I
you
mean, we're
know,
used to that. We're definitely used to kind of hearing through the ozoned, version, or the, Master X version of the two mix. What we're listening for is dropouts of instruments, and a lot of times I've caught delays that are not there, reverb tails that aren't there. So for a mixer, if I find something's missing, part of me is like, Danger Family Robinson, like, do not keep going, because chances are if I found like a guitar missing or a cymbal missing, chances are I'm going to get an email saying, oh, actually, I just realized I didn't print this reverb or something. So it kind of puts me at a standstill. I can't move forward with the cue. But yeah, normally we can listen past the mastering, depending on how much it's been nuked.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I know a lot of composers, you have to, I mean, this happens in record world too. I think it has started in record world and kind of filtered over into film world, is you have to impress the director with, especially if you're working on like an action cue, it has to hit hard in a certain way for them to approve it. Right. And so you're doing kind of like a pre-mix. It can be the ozone, whatever you slap that on. And then so if you then print all your stems through that nuked, bus processing, it can really tie the hands of your mixer down the line, because there's no headroom for us to work with. We're chasing this nuked mix that we can't really accomplish if all the stems are already there. So and there's maybe Laura, of course, like chime in on this. I think if you're sending like a nuked version, like kind of like a pseudo mastered version to your to the director or whoever's approving it, you can send that to us too as a reference. And then so there could be two ref mixes. There's the like pre-mastered ref mix, and then there's the ref mix that perfectly matches the stems.
100%.
That doesn't have the bus processing on it. That's the most helpful thing as a mixer, is then I can see, okay, this is what got approved. This sound, how did whatever bus processing they do, how did that affect the low end? How did that affect how punchy it is? How did it affect everything? So then I can match that as a mixer, working with the raw stems, where I actually have headroom, I have leeway, I have control, and things aren't already just squashed and overly compressed. And then it's like, well, there's only so much I can do.
Yeah, 100% plus 1000 to that. I worked on projects where the action, so much action, wall-to-wall music, that we've had to ask every composer, every writer who's shipping us cues, it's your nuked version, we get it. That's what that director thumbs up and rocked out to. But we also need the gut check ref, which is without the mastering, so that we can actually, every mixer does that one passive back. We're soloing the ref, going back to the stems. We're playing from top to bottom, maybe 3 times over to double check. As long as we have that clean ref, the one that's not nuked to the moon, then at least we can mute the ref. We have our sanity check, we call it, and we can start mixing. And then we use that nuked ref as a goalpost to kind of let us know what kind of harmonic stuff we need to do to kind of match the effect and the pumping effect.
And that being said, like, would you prefer that you use your own reverb, like that I would print all my stems kind of dry and give you some kind of reference mix, like the ozone mix, and then have you guys, except for like anything like a delay that would affect the sound, like it wouldn't be the same, or do you prefer that we print with our reverb? Because you kind of mentioned that.
Honestly, it really depends. It's project to project. That's why I listen to those two mixes so early on, before some poor assistant has to stay up to 4 a.m. printing stems, right? I don't want them to have to reprint it. And what I mean by that is sometimes I can hear in their two mixes, the reverb is really muddying up a lot of the space that I need to carve into. And a lot of people do a set it, forget it reverb. I'm a fan of putting an EQ on the reverb right before the reverb hits, because not only am I shaping what's going to the reverb, I'm giving myself space, because a lot of reverbs are great. They're warm sounding. I like those a lot better, but I'm EQing the crap out of my reverbs and making it my own. So if I listen to the 2 mix and I'm hearing problems with the reverbs and delay times or anything like that, or stuff's getting mushy, then I'll preemptively tell them, hopefully before that poor composer assistant is cranking out stems, losing sleep, can I please get either a screenshot of your reverb settings? Because chances are I have the reverb, so I can dial it in myself and carve it from there, season to taste. Maybe send me dry stem and one wet stem, or maybe just one dry stem for now. So I try to get ahead of it, but it really depends on the project. And if it's a composer I worked with before, normally all mixers have a note in their head, just like at the bank, when a customer calls, okay, this composer likes to use this Valhalla reverb, and they're not checking the low mids, and I already know to already preemptively ask for dry stems.
Should I close this window, or do you guys want to keep looking? Okay. Yeah, let's talk about putting EQ on the reverb, because I feel like I also teach at NYU, and I pretty much tell this to every single student of mine, and most of them don't know that you can put EQ on a reverb.
Yeah.
And that basically the idea is, if you put a high pass reverb and cut all the low off, none of the low stuff is going to go through the reverb, just those beautiful harmonic overtones and that space, and then you're going to avoid some mud, right?
It really depends for me. Like, I like to, again, I come from the old school world where Sylvia literally taught us to just close our eyes and like season to taste. So I kind of have that mentality. Yes, like what you're saying, a high pass filter, that's the go-to, but sometimes I just want to hear some of the lows and hear, sometimes, especially if it's samples and I'm working with some composers, all they have are samples. That's the budget they're working with. I try really hard to warm the samples a bit more. And in addition to some plugins I use to warm it, I also try to reshape the EQ, because sometimes the EQ, I mean, the reverb's doing something to give it some indication of life. So there is no this or that for me. It's more so season to taste. And I really value pre-fader sends too. I know a lot of people don't use that for obvious reasons. That can be tricky, but for those of you that don't know, you can have an aux send, a bus send, like you normally set up in Cubase or whatever you work in. They all have it, and that bus send, you set the independent, or that feed is not independent of your fader, right? So if you lower your long string on the fader, it lowers the feed to your reverb, right? There's no independence. With pre-fader send, you are now able to adjust how much wet signal or how much you feed the reverb versus your dry signal. So in a way, I'm a guitarist, I start off playing guitar. This is where this comes from. On guitar pedals, you have a dry and wet knob for some. So you're able to hear less of your dry direct signal versus your wet. And that's sort of what you're creating for yourself. I find that a lot more useful. Pre-fader sends for strings as well. It really allows you to ride throws and ride how you want the strings to breathe and tickle the reverb or delays that you have. And I find it useful. It's tricky for printing stems, but that's for us to figure out on the back end.
Yeah. How do you print stems from that?
Very carefully.
Very carefully.
So do you have to like make a pass through and then like incorporate it back into the mix almost? Is that what you're doing?
Ooh, this could be like, for me, this could be hours long conversation.
Okay.
It would help if I showed my template, but for me personally, I print stems again in food groups that are respected to the music editor, because that poor music editor is at the dub stage having to sometimes, at least the project I've been on, hack up new versions of cues with the stems that we print. So not just the composer's done, the cue's done. We've probably, if we have a really good music editor, they're smart enough to say, hey, let's record the longest version of this cue that was like 3 versions ago before it got shaved down, and then I'll cut it up on the back end. So at least when the director comes in and says, I changed my mind, we have some extra, stuff to pull out on the handles on the audio. So for me, I'm asking the music editor, what do you need from me? And sometimes there's a certain sound that a composer created for certain cues that they want completely isolated. It could be an effect, a reverse effect, something that gives some foreshadowing. So to me, my stems are not something I create for myself. More so it's between myself and the music editor about what they need to make their job better, easier.
Right.
I'm just an Uber driver, so, but for the technical parts of the stems, because I do, different type of effects to have everything glued together. I do a lot of side chaining, which there's not enough time to talk about side chaining for folks that don't know, but
Yeah.
basically my final mix matches my stems. When I A/B them, my stems pump the same if it's pumping. If it's an action movie, I just work on a lot of action stuff. It's going to pump the same as my ref mix. You're not going to feel a dropout. And the reason being is if the music editor decides to go back into the stems to do an edit, they should be able to, mute that final 5-1, 7-1, whatever, and then edit within the stems and then hit play. And then what goes to the dub mixer is the same sounding mix that I had before, the final print. Hope that makes sense. It's really hard to explain without a template.
Yeah. I kind of want to go off. A lot of us have to mix our own stuff. And, I think using some of your wisdom, can we talk about how you work with like the architecture of the stereo spectrum? And is there like a certain process of like, do you start every piece of music in the same way? I mean, obviously you're working with different pieces of music that vary between, like you already said, you're working with emotional, airy things or pumping things, but is it typically a bottom up process, like bottom meaning mix low to high and center to out, or does it change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to give a very Rick Rubin answer, but I really mean it. I let the music tell me what I start with. Sometimes, again, if the composer sent me their widest cue, normally everything's being thrown out the wall for this one. It's great for me to map out my template and kind of get, a picture of what I need to do. But sometimes I want to hear, an orchestra heavy cue. And so I guess I answer my own question. I like to listen to the orchestra first. Also because I want to catch any mistakes that were made in orchestra recording and find out, is a cello like really loud and just in general, and is, like how do I spend a lot of time with the live elements first, balancing them out, making sure they're all panned correctly, and then digging into some of the overdubs if there's any, especially if I didn't record them. I want to make sure I catch any of if someone recorded drum. A lot of people don't know how to record drums sometimes, and stuff is out of phase. So really checking the phase. It takes me hours to check the phase on drums, because fixing the phase will actually sometimes make your drums work for you. And now I'm doing less EQ and less shimmery effects, because when the phase is all correct, the low end's really coming in really nicely. And oh wow, we have like a drummer now. And so I think it depends on the music for me.
Andrea, do you have
I
any?
agree. I absolutely agree. It depends on the music. My mind was going also to, a pop song versus, a song or like a cue with orchestra. This can be completely different, the way you approach it, the way you think about it. One thing that I would add is something that I learned from working as an assistant for a lot of mixers and watching mixers work, is to remember that you're working in the context of the whole song. I think a lot of people when they're starting out mixing, and I did this too when I was starting, is you immediately start soloing. Okay, what does the bass sound like? And you just work on the bass and work on the bass. And okay, now I'm going to listen to the kick drum and work on the kick. And then you put it all together and you weren't doing anything in context.
Yep. Great point.
So, I think that's one of the biggest things that I've learned is I start with everything up. You start the mix with, like, if someone sent you stems where you can put everything at 0, like that's where I start.
Yeah.
And because every element that you're working on, it's working in the context of something. Like I had someone even say to me, like, what, is it going to be a bass solo? I was like, no, but I'm working on the bass. Well, is the song a bass solo? No, but it's like, okay, well, no one's ever going to hear the bass soloed. So why are you spending an hour with the bass soloed? No one's ever going to hear it that way. And there are things that if you listen in isolation, you'll make decisions and changes that aren't actually at the service of the mix and aren't necessary, maybe.
That's such a fantastic point.
That's a great point.
Context is so important. We have a question in the chat, and we want to encourage all of you to ask questions as they come up. There is I see your hand up. I'm so sorry. We're just going to get to it in a second. Is there any tips to print MIDI to audio without hiccups? I sometimes have issues on printing a big arrangement, and occasionally the strings record with hiccups in sustains.
You and a lot of people.
Everybody does. Don't worry about
Everybody.
it. Some composers, I'm not going to say their names, deal with that all the time. And then we catch it in the mix, and we either have to ask them to reprint it, or we just try to use isotope to cut out the pops or make our own reverb.
Yeah, and this is the kinds of things that when we're A-Bing those stems versus the ref mix, these are the kinds of things that we're checking for as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I was a tech assistant for some composers for a bit as well, I think sometimes they find out, oh, you do tech stuff, come help me in my room. So you're like, okay, I'm not mixing, I'm not recording, I'm helping you figure this out. I think for that, it's checking your system, making sure that your hard drives are fast enough. I think a lot of people don't realize the signs that your hard drive, whatever system you have your samples running off of, making sure that your hard drives are not about to tell you goodnight. That's normally
possibly your buffer size, maybe.
Yeah, buffer size, your RAM, we can go down a rabbit hole today, but I don't think we
okay. I hope that answered your question. Okay, good. Hope, you have a question.
Yeah. Hi, thanks so much.
It's
been so great. I am a composer and songwriter. In the past year, have kind of dove into producing my own songs, which is therefore meant to really become a mixer. I've realized how much they go so hand in hand.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to kind of figure out if I were to venture out and mix somebody else's stuff, that feels like a big leap from knowing my own creative vision and the project and my voice and all those things.
Yeah.
But I just was wondering some of the questions as you're working with a new client or somebody sends you a mix, what are some of the things you ask the client before you dive into their specific project?
Really good question. I don't know. I guess if it's album work, record work, I definitely approach that differently than film score work. They're just two completely different, vibes, I guess. But it's interesting you mentioned your producer wanting to mix, because that's what Sylvia, and I'm sure Linda Perry as well, they write songs, they produce, and they mix. And I guess it's finding a delicate balance, really. For me, I like sitting next to the artist and letting them take control. I've co-produced on stuff. So it's just really, it's like a dance. It's knowing when to step in, when to be the backseat driver, and when to just help facilitate the energy in the room and the creative aspect. It's really reading the room, right? So that being said, when an artist reaches out to me, if they are wanting to do a record, I like to meet with them in person and really talk to them about, if I've never met them before, I like to talk about what their goals are, just sonically, things that inspire them. I find when you ask people what inspires their music, chances are that's going to be the ref tracks that come up. And when we talk about ref tracks in this sense, we're talking about if a band, I'm really inspired by Feist. I like her latest Magnitude album, that's it's Multitudes, that's what it's called, really great album. Then I'm like, cool, I have a sonic note in my head to go home and really vibe out to that album again, to kind of get my brain locked into what they're aiming for. If it's a film, if it's a composer, we don't really have time for that. A lot of the composers are really busy, and to be honest, they'll say, this may be a movie they're passionate about, and I'll be honest, some composers are like, I don't like this movie, it's not that great, I just need your help to really get this stuff to elevate. And in that case, we're having a realistic expectations conversation. I find though with film score work, it's less about inserting your creative opinion and more so, as dry as the sound, just getting it to sound bigger, as Mandy touched on it. My job is to not start to say, hey, I think we should rearrange these strings. And, I have this idea about running it for guitar pedal. Everyone's like, that's cute. Move on, please. I got to get this done by tomorrow morning. So it's really knowing who you're working with and what stage of the game they're at. If a composer calls me and says, hey, I want you to do the mix, but I have all these questions about, I know you worked with Sylvia, which has happened before, and I want to record a band, or I know Steve worked with Imagine Dragons at some point. He knows nothing about working with some of these bands. So I came in to kind of help facilitate how to talk with them, how to get some of the energy going. It's different, right? In film score world, you're dealing with session musicians who are punctual. and you put sheet music in front of them, they actually tune their instruments sometimes. Wow.
Mhm.
And you put like 4 hours worth of music and they knock it out in 2, and you're like, cool, bye, I'm off to some Taylor Swift recording at Capitol. You're like, great. Whereas working with the record side, it's all about vibe, right? You know, you're working with a guitarist who's like, I need to change the lighting, I need some whiskey, I want to talk about my dog today. And it's like, great, this is all like a different shift, right, of expectations. So for me, it gets really artsy. I'm just talking with them about what they're expecting from me for the project, so I know what my role is and where to kind of step back.
I love this.
That's great. Thank you.
Oh wait, I have a question, you guys. When you're working with, because I'm mostly working in film music or something that has some kind of dialogue track or something, and of course I try to write to support the dialogue. Of course, anything can happen in the dub, and they can shift your cue, and it doesn't really matter. But when you guys are mixing the cues, are you referencing, do you check it against the audio from the film and like sound
100%.
key sound effects and everything?
100%. If we're lucky, the effects are sort semi done. I don't know about you, Andrea, but like sometimes by the time the mix is given to us, the dub stage is demanding stuff now. We're chasing the dub, as they call it.
The dub.
Yeah.
Always fun. Always fun.
Uh-huh.
But in my opinion, you know, even composers, a lot of the ones we work with, we have to demand the dialogue for them, like the most latest dialogue track, so they can actually know more or less what they're aiming for. Also, you know, a lot of the composers I worked with, like, you know, Steve and stuff like that, and Lauren, like they're actually writing their strings and choosing their samples when dialogue comes in. So there's a lot of like strategic planning on their end that I think some people don't realize. They're adding their own filters over the top of the strings. They're adding filters on the reverb to really make space for that dialogue, but also making sure that if the dialogue's muted and you're listening to the album, you don't hear that drop. You know what I mean? So yes, as a mixer, I'm asking, is this the latest dialogue track I can get? Is this the latest VFX, you know, effects track, especially if it's a heavy action movie? We definitely need that, because at some point, as Andrea said, you're soloing stuff and you're like, wait, let me unmute the rest of it, and there's like an explosion happening. Why are you spending 3 hours trying to get the bass to
Now
not
hear it there?
We have a lot of questions in the chat, so I want to address some of them. Here's one. I am currently working on a mix where everything sounds nice and wide in stereo, but then when I mono collapse it, it sounds like a lot is missing. Do you think that's a phasing issue or anything else I can check?
Welcome to the wonderful world of
phase.
Check and phase.
Check and phase.
Yeah, and that comes from our record world, right? That's we always, it's drilled into our brains, even when you're in tracking stages with a band, always checking phase. We're always, the band's just sitting there like, are you done yet? Nope. Checking the phase on everything in my tracking session. So yeah, it's so important to check that. It's so important to check that before you even start slapping EQ and reverbs on stuff. You really want to start with the dry stuff as is, and especially if you didn't record it, you really got to extra check someone else's work, because phasing will really bite you in the butt later on.
So do you check the phase by monoing it, or is there a different way? That's
probably the tall tale way. There's also soloing individual tracks. Like if I, this is I don't know how into the weeds we want to get here. But for a lot of the composers I worked with, they record live drum kits. And I'm always a stickler who's like, before we start laying down cues, like before we start sitting here for 4 hours recording back-to-back cues with his drum kit, let's listen to the phase of all the mics. So I'll sit there. It's a mixture between headphones and speakers. It's just from all the training I did with Sylvia, I already know what it sounds like and what are some tall tale signs. I record little bits of
what exactly, because I am personally not fantastic at this. So what is a sign of a phase issue besides this mono?
There's many, but the biggest sign for me is low end missing. When you start flipping the phase on your microphones, let's say you have a 3-piece tom drum kit. This can even happen with bass. People don't realize that when you record DI bass and then you record their amp, because a lot of people do both because they want to be able to use
Mhm.
the DI signal to feed a different amp simulator if they hate the sound of the amp.
Right.
There's time alignment. So a lot of times I'll have the basses hit their strings, and then you get that recording in your Pro Tools session. If you work with Pro Tools, doesn't matter. Don't care what DAW you use, but
Right.
you'll see the transient, and you want to line those up. You can also see on the waveforms, that they're not gelling. And then when you A/B some of the direct versus like the amp sound, you'll hear your pre-changes, you'll hear something this doesn't feel like the amp I was sitting in a room listening to, right? And then you start to flip the phase, or there's some plugins where you can, gradually, change things. And then all of a sudden you hear the low end come back and you're like, there it is. I think the biggest thing though is using your ears. It goes back to call it old school or whatever. I like to sit in the room with a musician. I like to sit in the room with the strings. Whoever I'm recording, I sit in the room while they're tuning and while I'm moving mics around. If it doesn't sound the same in the room, something's wrong, right? 90% of the battle is just not screwing up a brilliant musician, a brilliant instrument. I mean, you've got to be doing something wrong if it doesn't sound the same inside the room. And that's the 101 gut check of, if it doesn't sound the way it did in the room, and they're amazing musician, they're got a great instrument, I got to check what I'm doing because I'm screwing this up.
Yeah. Great. Do you have more to add to that, or?
I was going to add, as a mixer, when you're receiving it, I mean, this can kind of happen on both sides, I think, record world and film world, that people who are doing kind of producing their own things, or they're trying to do a pre-mix before they send it to you, people will slap on like a stereo widener because it sounds great. And that can that can add all kinds of phase issues in the mix. People, it's like these kind of quick fixes end up, giving you more headache down the road. So if you're mixing someone else's stuff, and you're seeing all these issues, maybe ask them, hey, did you throw a stereo widener out there? Is there any processing that maybe we don't need? And let me handle that later. You could delicately sort of probe and see what's going on earlier that might be causing, because, when you're recording, live drums and this, everything that Laura was saying, yes, of course, a lot of stuff now is not recorded live, it's computer generated, sample generated. And that even too, it's like you're dealing with different libraries and different, so there can just be kind of inherent phase discrepancies with the material that you're getting. So yeah, it's a whole can of worms, but
yeah, that's a great point, because even the up mixers, we have some composers that use up mixers to 5-1 their stuff, and I will take this with me to the grave. You can't set it and forget it with up mixers. I call it the fast food up mix. You really have to, have the time to A/B pre-up mix versus up mixed, and really pay attention to what it's doing, because sometimes that can cause a lot of, not so fun stuff.
Is an up mix of 5.1? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, like an example would be Nugent, and this is probably more for mixers. Like we use up mixers to get like your stereo file to become 5.1.
Okay. It's like
we don't manufacture it. Yeah.
Okay, I get it.
Or in some cases, Atmos.
I think this next question that someone posted, I think you've already touched on it earlier a little bit, and the question is, what are your tips to make samples sound more alive from reverb, and warming the sound with EQ? And you kind of talked about special saucing it up earlier. And then I think something you just said, Andrea, about phasing, I think this can all tie in together, is like when you're mixing samples with live instruments. So we're dealing with this is a multi-part question. There's like, how do you make samples sound better? And then how do you mix these samples that come from all these different recording studios into this new sounding mix that umbrellas everything? So it's kind of multi-faceted question, but let's start with the original question, was how do you warm the sound of these samples?
It's not a one-size-fits-all, right?
And go.
$1 million question.
Oh boy, how do we elevator pitch this? Where do we start? Well, for me personally, I've been really grateful to be in live scoring sessions and be in the rooms when strings are, like you take that audible memory, put it in your head, kind of like how people know how salsa should taste and how taco should taste, from wherever you're from. And so I don't underestimate the human brain to be able to remember what stuff is supposed to translate like. And for me, it's a feeling. I know how strings are supposed to feel when I close my eyes and I hit play. Samples, it also depends on, I'll be quite blunt. Some composers can really program the heck out of their samples to where you're like, damn, what do they do? This sounds amazing. For a lot of composers, they're layering, there's some who I see, because I get to see their Cubase sessions. There's Spitfire strings, blend it with some other obscure thing, and then blend it with this thing. And it's like a layered cake, and only certain pieces of that cake make features in certain bits of the piece of music. And then they're also automating reverb, and they're doing all the stuff that you all know that composers do to make their samples sing. So I don't mean to offload this to the composer, but really get your chops up on how to carve out a string sample. And it may be the problem is it's not plural, using more than one string, blending to make that contour and shape and weight, so that when you close your eyes, it really is doing something. So help us out a bit. But if, again, there's budgets, there's strict timelines. For me, it's listening to the strings and inserting some sort of tape warmer. I like a plugin called Magnetic 2, and I'm not really here to plug plugins at all, because didn't have time to preach about this before, but I come from a world where I didn't have money. My parents didn't have money to buy me stuff, so I really made do with what I had, which now looking back at it really taught me how to make do with what I have regardless. So I'm not a fan of saying certain plugins you should buy to do this.
Right.
Not going to get that from me today.
But it's basically like a saturator.
Yes, saturator, and also really gluing the bottom end or creating some sort of glue. I used to work with a lot of Neve analog consoles with Sylvia and Fairchild compressors, and being able to close my eyes and hear stuff just glue just on bypass or just like running through the console. And that's what I chase. I like the VEQ by Waves. That EQ reminds me of the Neve EQ, how it's supposed to breathe, not breathe, but how it reacts and how it just kind of warms things up. And sometimes it's really experimenting with my reverbs, just like what I talked about pre-fader sends. I'm imitating the breathing of what an instrument would do when someone pulls off the strings, or when they finish that one or transition or slide into another thing. I'm using my pre-fader send to artificially create the room singing in a way that I want. So it's not just reverb being slapped on a string section and calling it a day, because that can actually work against you and make everyone realize it's in a plastic room that isn't real, which it still is, but you're making it breathe. So I think for me, it's a dance between warming the sample, and if there's nothing there for me to play with and I'm kind of screwed, then it's leaning into the reverb pathways and EQing my reverb and maybe creating an artificial pump with compressors as well to kind of get the room feeling like it's breathing.
Sounds like a lot of patience.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Hey, it's our job, right? We're mixers.
I
should be the most patient.
I think a lot of us, with this instant gratification of pressing a keyboard key and getting any sound we want, we do want this instant gratification. We want to just press a button and use isotope to make everything sound great on one thing and hurry up and get back to writing. But like, mixing is just so important. It takes so much time. And I mean, I hear what you guys are talking about, and you're putting so much thought into every single little step. And it really, and I think, and this is going to address a question about mud, if you're putting all this thought into everything, then you shouldn't have mud, right? But we'll come back to mud. But Andrea, did you want to add anything to it? And also, I think, is it fair to say if we get a good clean sound on these string samples, will it play better with live samples?
Yeah. Again, it's not a one size fits all.
Live strings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something I was thinking about earlier that like I spent a lot of time playing in bands with string players, like playing with live. So I understand what it's supposed to sound like. I didn't realize all those years were training my ear in that way of like, oh, I understand that something about that articulation. Like, I'm not a string player, but I can tell when an articulation doesn't sound natural. Like something about the cutoff, something about the way it's coming in, because so many, so many people are playing these samples on keyboard. I mean, primarily, right? And so the way that I'm a piano player, so I understand the way that I would articulate on the keys is not the way that you would articulate on strings. So if you're a composer and you want to write for strings, spend some time with string players, like spend some time listening, go listen to an orchestra performance. If you like, go make friends with a violin player and hang out and say like, hey, will you teach me something about like, you just have to tune your ear to what it actually sounds like, which I think to Lori's point before is she knows when the orchestra is sounding right because she's experienced that, right? And so unfortunately, there is no quick answer. There's no quick fix. Nothing replaces years of tuning your ear to what live strings sound like. And this goes for any instrument, right? Not just strings. But so that's the long answer that maybe no one wants to hear.
Well, also, can I add that because you
Yeah.
said you're playing it on a piano? I mean, I see this a lot with my students too. Strings are not chord instruments.
Right.
So I think I'll sometimes somebody will show me something and they'll play something and I'm like, well, this string section doesn't sound real because you've programmed it as a chord and it sounds like an organ because you've programmed it like an organ.
Right.
But if you go back and play them with different samples for each line and play them in, and then it probably will sound more real. Hope has had her hand up for a while, so I want to address this. Oh wait, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. I just have another question about, I appreciate what you're saying, Lori, about like not coming from money and like trying to be careful about that, because it was a perfect segue to what I wanted to ask, which was I'm not quite at the point of like getting my own studio space yet. And I feel like I'm doing a good job, if I say so myself, with the space that I have and getting good mixes. But like, I recognize that that there's a big leap to having a truly treated space. And I guess like, because that leap to a studio is such a big one at this point, especially in LA, like the cost is so insane. What would be like your suggestions of like, how do I baby step this? I can't just go take out a $20,000 loan and do something. I can't just rent a $2,500 studio a month. I don't have 4 bedrooms, so just like the suggestion of what's some good like baby steps that isn't the financial ruin of your career.
Can I add to this, because we had a question that was sent in and it was somebody was going from mixing from headphones to going to mixing to their speakers, but they didn't mention that they're probably in an untreated room. And so I think to add to your question, Hope, is how do you, when you're mixing in an untreated space, how do you translate that so that it will sound, how do you check that to sound good?
Well, first off, I want to encourage you, Hope, because it took me 18 years to get my own personal studio. I have some speakers behind me because I'm waiting for my actual home studio to be finished being built. And I get very emotional when I think about it because it's a long way over here. Imagine doing this for 18 years and, I would barter with composers, and especially I worked for Steve Jablonski, who I'm going to shout him out right now, because I worked with him recording for him and creative ideas, and then he traded off with me being allowed to use his mix room that I managed to do my own projects for people. So because of him, I was able to really get my career offloaded because I too couldn't afford, the rent for LA alone just to live is ridiculous. So I hear you. For me, it's maybe a bartering system too. There's some composers who do have some really great studios, and if you're able to help them or friends, I know that's a stretch for some folks, but I guess if I go down to the technical part of it, it's tuning a room, really looking into, there's so many software programs I could list, but there's a lot out there because more and more people are working from home. We had COVID kick off. There's a lot of people who do pre-mixing for dub mixes even at home nowadays. You know, people want to spend more time with their family. So it's definitely not as much of a jarring thing to say out loud, to say I mix from home, because now it's like the norm. I would, you know, I think we talked about this, Andrea and I, being able to understand acoustics in your space. There are some companies out there online, even locally, that build panels, and they'll even come out and listen to your room, or they do a FaceTime and kind of tell you just, you know, strategically where you want to put acoustic panels. I think the biggest thing for transitioning to a space, even if you're a mixer who mixes at home and then you go rent a, you know, like a space at the Village or something for an artist playback, which you can also do. It's having a source, a playlist of some sort. Like I have mixes I've done in the past on a hard drive. I have songs from different artists that I've listened to throughout the years, and I'll just spend like an hour to 2 hours in a new space listening to that song over and over again, and it helps to tell me how my ears need to adjust for the space. Of course, that's after doing like a sweep of the room, pink noise or whatnot, to get all the speakers calibrated. We're not going to get into the weeds about that, but that's a whole class. But you know, calibrating the speakers, you know, checking how the speaker response is in the room, and then playing back a playlist that you're familiar with of artists that you've spent, you know, days dissecting their production techniques. If you listen to it to these new spaces, whether on headphones or speakers, your brain will start to tell you something. I may not have experience, right? You may tell yourself, I don't have experience in ear training for many years working next to mix assistant, you know, big mixers, but your ears will tell you something's different. You know, if you listen to Queen of the Stone Age and you like their basses and how deep they go, or Beyonce's deep bass drops, and you go into a room and it's not there, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, right? Like something's out, something's not right with the space, and maybe I need to not do it here or have a gut check somewhere else. So I think, yeah, having ref material, not a bad idea.
Can I ask, like also like if you're using some kind of visual monitor to, like, if you're listening to that Queens of the Stone Age song and you're like, oh, this is what this looks like, this is what a full mix to me, or to me, this is what I was referring to me, it's a reference mix. Like something's inspiring me to get my feeling of my mix. Maybe it's like totally different instrumentation. But if I'm looking at my visual monitor, I see that it's at like, you know, -6 or something, or, you know, and then when I play my, like, are you turning up the volume to make it sound like that? Like, don't touch your volume. Like to me, I have a set space on my, I use like a big knob as to control my monitor. And I just have like a spot, like you could even like put a pencil like mark on it, or
every
sticker.
composer has their notch on the knob that if it's not they're not going to keep
like,
playing. I hear you. That's where room calibration really comes into play. Like at Netflix, I do a lot of room calibration for them for their spaces. It's there's a whole science to it, and we can have a separate, you know, email me for coffee and I'll go over it with you. I don't want to bore everyone with this, but it's literally to keep it simple as an audio tech, and that's why you have people like us, you know, to offload that information to. But we run pink noise, this very specific pink noise file through every speaker, and we get it to a certain SPL level with a calibrated SPL meter. And that at least gets every speaker to the recommended SPL level that we need to hit, depending on, you know, if we're doing 5.1, you know, if you go on the Dolby site, they have like Dolby, if you really want to nerd out, they have Dolby, you know, documents about recommendations for how your room should be calibrated. And it's also based on the size. So I can't say crank your speakers to 89 dB when you're working in a smaller room. That's unsafe for your ears. And then that goes into like a whole class on ear safety. A lot of people don't realize that even though some people like Hans mixes at 82 to 85 dB, a lot of the mixers I work next to work at 82 to 85 dB, but that's really loud, and that's not 100% of the time. They drop it down to really do edits, to do mix, you know, nudges here and there, and then they do a ref check for at least 5 minutes at that level, because, you know, we go to ear safety. You don't want to blow your ears out because you've been ripping your face off with the same cue for 8 hours at that level. It's really unsafe, permanent hearing damage. So there's a whole class to be had on that. But long story short, you know, connect with someone like us and we'll be sure to walk you through that on the side. Yeah.
Andrea, did you have some?
Yes, I feel like there's so much there's so much information out there about, tuning your room and this and that, and it can get really, really overwhelming. I've absolutely dealt with this same question. And I do a lot of work on headphones for that reason, because I trust them, but you have to know the limitations of what you're working with. So I can get a lot of work done on headphones, but I know that I'm not accurately hearing the low end, right? Because of the limitations of what I'm using. So you have to, everyone's working with some kind of limitation. Nobody has a perfect room. There is no perfect room. I think, of course, some rooms are tuned better and there's, more care that's been into that and resources and whatnot. But just understanding the limitations of what you're working with, and then how to check yourself in a different space that will give you the information that you need, so that's why you listen in the car, right? Like so I've done mixes on headphones and go in the car and it's like, okay, my low end's blowing up because I couldn't properly hear that. Great. Now I know, and I can go back and I can check that, and listening on all different kinds of, so all the big mixers I've worked for, that work in record world, especially, will check it on their phone. Because guess how 90% of people are going to hear your mix for the first time is on their phone. So the low end has to translate. Your phone's not going to play back that low end, but you have to cheat in a way that's going to hit on your phone, and it's going to give the sensation of the low end coming through on different platforms. And that's can be so, it's so interesting, and it never ends with mixing. And it's also very frustrating because you spend all this time crafting the sound for people to listen on earbuds or on their phone. And so it's kind of, just understanding the limitations of what you're working with, because everyone's working with limitations, and you don't need the $10,000 speakers to get a good mix. I had last summer I had the chance to go do a seminar with Chad Blake, who in the record world is, he's a really fantastic, very artistic mixer. And he said he works in an untreated room on, like speakers that nobody's ever heard of, because he knows them. He knows what they sound like, and he knows what his room sounds like, and he just intuitively knows the limitations of his room. And so you don't need all that stuff as long as you understand what you're working with.
A really great point. We have some more questions. Looks like how I guess so, like, somebody, before we get to these new questions, somebody did send a question in about mud. Okay, so how do you have any tips on removing mud? And let's talk about what is mud, and how do you approach it, and let's just talk about what mud is.
Yeah, for me, that's like low mids. But again, it's like what Andrea was saying, and what I believe too is how are you dissecting this? Is it on solo, right? Because I can solo up live orchestra and sometimes hear mud. I can solo up a nice omnisphere synth and hear mud. But when I unsolo it, mud needs to be there because it's doing something to the overall context of the piece of music. So for me, it's really goes back to the original, we talk about speakers translating, because that's what this all comes down to. Is your room translating the way you're familiar with? Check. Because the last thing you want to do is start EQing stuff out with mud, and it's your room, and you realize it's your room that's building this mode that is building up all those low end. And if you tilt your head this way, it's gone, and you tilt your head this way, it's gone. It's just where you're sitting in the room, and now you're chasing a ghost. So, it goes back to the foundational knowledge of, are you comfortable with your speakers? Are you used to them? Have your ears adjusted to them? Do you trust them? And then go from there. And how does that instrument sing with the rest of the mix? Now, if it is a problematic mud after doing all that, and that's not an artistic intent, then I'll be, carving that out. I don't do anything too drastic when it comes to the film scoring side, because a lot of the composers I work with, I trust their process. I trust that a lot of the decisions they made were for a reason, and I don't want to completely scoop something out and then it just makes that thing sound really anemic and hollow. So it's just, I don't really know how to answer that other than there's not a one size fits all. But the first question I'll ask is this to make room for for other instruments to sing better? Is this carving out space for the sonic spectrum? And if it is, then okay, chances are that this chunk of stuff needs to go that is muddying up the mix.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a thought of what we were talking about earlier with EQing reverbs, because
Mhm.
reverbs can often be the culprit of adding a lot of mud. And I just had a thought that you can, for someone who had never thought, oh, I didn't know I could EQ reverb, you can EQ your material before it hits the reverb, and you can EQ after the reverb. So there's kind of two ways of thinking about it. So if your material has a lot of that low mids, and that's adding something sonically, that's adding a warmth, you maybe want to keep that in the raw file, but then when you send it to your reverb, before it hits the reverb, you might throw an EQ on that cuts that out so that that part's not getting sent to the reverb. So it's not accentuating that more, possibly. And that may be more effective than throwing the EQ on after the reverb once it's done the processing. So it's things you can think about, that there's so many different places along the chain that you can address these things.
Yeah.
And just understanding like what is being what is problematic, where is it originating? And a lot of times it's like detective work. It's like, okay, what is causing this? You go through and like, sometimes it'll be muting stuff and you finally mute, a synth sound and it's like, oh, okay, it's gone.
It's that pad you underestimated.
Yeah.
That's eating up everything.
Exactly.
Thank you. Those were great answers. Okay, we have another question. How dynamic do you recommend the mix of the score to be? I like adding a layer of subtle texture on main melodies, but sometimes when it comes on the web or screen, it can later sound too quiet. Do you recommend checking the mix with various speakers, your monitor with sub, headphones, consumer speaker? I mean, it's kind of like what we just talked about, but
yeah, ref checking. I know when we're working on Tron, was it Tron Legacy? Yeah, the sequel, Daft Punk, that was their first mesh with film score additions, and Joe Trapanese was an amazing composer that worked with them, and they really wanted us to somehow pipe audio to either laptop speakers or offload some of the mixes to the laptop speakers, and they're really making sure that after every mix before it gets approved, they listen to it on their laptop speakers, and they would just sit in a room and listen to them. And I thought that was fantastic. And that is for that reason, to make sure all their synths that they spent so much time shaping and building, because they really do. I think people underestimate how much Daft Punk really sits in their space and
their
Logic.
mixes are phenomenal.
Yeah, and seeing them run their, talk about samples and stuff, they run their samples through guitar pedals and then loop them back in, and they would add texture and contour and shape, and that was such a cool thing to see. But because they spent so much time intentionally building these sounds themselves, they wanted to make sure that it was actually translating the mix, and they were giving notes based off of some of the playback on the laptop. So don't be afraid to do what's suggested here is checking it in various spaces, even sound bars if you like. That's probably the easier one with Apple TV and everything happening. So yeah, just check it. And it really is season to taste. There's some projects I worked on where everything's just flatlined, wall-to-wall music. And there's some where people just really want stuff to breathe. And I guess it comes down to everything, all those factors.
And also, I mean, if the music is inside of a show or a film, what happens on the dub stage can really change everything. It sometimes it's really important to be at that mix. And
100%.
Or have somebody make sure your music editor, somebody's representing you.
100%. There's so many stories of dub mixers completely ruining the mix. And having a music editor that's not afraid to speak up and is your
I mean,
advocate
sometimes
is so important.
The director is giving notes to the sound mixer, and the sound mixer or the dub mixer is like basically just a machine, like listening. I mean, they don't care about the score as much as the sound, and the director might be, everybody's ears get tired, their ears might be tired. They're like, or they've heard the score so much that they know it, that the same way that sometimes it's hard to mix your own music because half of it's in your head. It's not, are you really referencing what you're hearing or what's in your head? And I think the same thing happens to directors, producers, and they might lower the mix. And
yeah, and then as a mixer, I'm making sure that when dialogue kicks in, I'm doing little things to the strings, especially because if the strings are sometimes overbearing in the dial, or can be, and the mixer, at the dub stage, they have it turned up. Instead of just saying, hey, can the music editor poke at the string stem and lower it, they're just going to bring that whole fader down for that 5/1 mix. So as a mixer, I'm putting EQs over the tops of strings and delicately putting a filter, if the composer hasn't already automated that into their own programming, and doing them a favor to hopefully not get the whole mix turned down because somebody doesn't want to spend 2 seconds for the music editor to find the stem and turn that one thing down, so it's definitely a team effort. But I think the biggest thing I've seen is a music editor that really has your back and is not afraid to say, give me a second, can we just not do that? Can we dig in a little deeper?
It's so important. Did you have anything to add to that, Andrea, or we covered?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. Does anyone have any more questions? I can go back to my questions. Hi. When do you know when you're done with a mix? This is a great question. It feels like a never-ending process. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think for the record side, it can feel like a never-ending process, which is the only time I'll say I love when record labels are involved, because they'll crack the whip and say, we need that done tomorrow. And you're like, okay, someone's got to be the adult here. So, I've seen records. I've been on recording projects for 3 to 4 months with an artist from top to bottom. And, it's like what you said. If I were to ever make my own record as a musician, I would definitely hire someone else to mix it, because I think when you have folks recording and mixing, producing their own stuff, you really don't know when to let go, right? And sometimes it helps to have that, in my opinion, it helps to have that second brain there that you trust to kind of either take it in a new direction or tell you when it's done. Everybody needs that. And the record world is arbitrary. The goalpost moves a lot, but for film score world, that's where I really appreciated being able to know a deadline's going to hit, and when that dub stage starts tapping the music editor, we call it pencils down, and mix needs to be sent. So I guess in a more dry way of saying it, in the record world, it's a vibe, and on the film score world, there's an actual post schedule that everyone needs to abide by. So someone's got to send something by 8 a.m. to the dub stage at a certain time. But really, it's not my call. At the end of the day, in my opinion, it's done when the composer's happy with it. I don't call that at all.
Yeah, I think it's piggyback on what you were saying. It's so important to get feedback from other ears on it, and especially kind of thinking more in like the record world side, especially if you're the artist and you're producing, you're trying to mix your own stuff. Yeah, getting some kind of outside feedback on that can give you just some point of reference, because otherwise it's so easy to get caught in just your own world with something and just go deep and deep and deep and get really nitpicky about something that maybe no one else, it isn't as in the big picture, it isn't the most important thing. So just getting some kind of external feedback on that can be really helpful to know when you're close, and you'll probably never feel like done. Like, I don't think I've ever been like, this is a perfect mix.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
Yeah.
Done.
No one doesn't not have a pit in their stomach when they hit that send button.
Yes.
And it's off to the ethers. My stomach drops all the time, but
yeah.
I think that's just the mark of like also people feeling really passionate. I think I try to put that energy into something positive, because I can be an anxious person too. And for me, it's like, I'm so grateful I have this feeling, because it means I care and I'm still passionate about what I do. And I think that's how I try to think about it too, with the composers who just don't want to let it go. It's like, isn't it cool that we're passionate about this, that we have to be the best it can be?
I always say, like, when I get a new project, if I'm not terrified, something's wrong.
100%.
like it's always like, oh, okay, yeah, I told him I can do this. Can I do it?
But Mandy, I think there's something to be said that a lot of us in this industry, we operate really well under pressure. It may not be our favorite thing, but something about that switch turning off, like, okay, it's go time. through this pressure.
Mhm.
And it seemed to, I think people in this industry are very resilient when it comes to that.
I cannot
Yeah.
work without a deadline. I
Yeah.
can't. If I was
Mhm.
making a personal project album, it would take me 15 years
Yeah.
because I mean, like, I just need that the switch that turns my brain off, that
Yeah.
says like stop. I watched this TED talk on procrastinating and how it's actually a good thing, because it's like you spend like, you have to write this paper or whatever, and the paper's due in 15 hours, and you wait till the 14th hour. And if that's your process, then that's cool, because you figured out a way to to find your focus, and
Yeah.
you sat there for 14 hours thinking about it. It's not like you weren't thinking about it, so it's in there. But
Yeah, I know a very big composer who, when the interns come and say your food's arrived, he starts writing.
Yeah.
It's that pressure's on, or you know, your Uber's here, they start writing. And
yeah,
it's just some people, I think I think the artists, you know, our brains are just wired that way. We can use it to our advantage.
we have a comment. I taught computer science for years. We have a basic maxim for programmers and software designers: there's always one more bug. Apparently it's true for mixers. Always one more tweak.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I had a couple questions. What about signal chain? Do you have like a default like system that you guys use? Or is it different for each project? But is it generally you go through this? Can we talk about that? And do you build this into your template? And do you ever reverse it halfway through a project? Or
I know for me, if I'm recording for a composer, I normally just have a template that has the bare necessities at first. Like I have recording tracks, and I color code them, and I preemptively name them so that when I do new playlist, it fills in like track numbers and it helps me do boring file management of different takes we do. And I have like a standard reverb, maybe 2 different reverbs, and 3 different delays. And then I might have one track that has a couple compressors that I like to use just on standby, so that, you know, the last thing an audio engineer wants is people waiting on them in the room in the middle of a recording session. You don't want to you don't want to be the reason why someone broke their idea. And so I'll just have this bare bones stuff, so I'm not sitting there on my IO setup creating buses in the middle of an amazing idea someone had. So that's pretty grab and go for me. But needless to say, the template builds as the artist comes in. I start seeing them unload more gear, and I'm like, okay, I gotta have this, and maybe add this, and you know, have the spare bus for this. When it comes to mixing, that too is determined by all the information I talked about earlier that I get from the music editor, and that kind of shapes my workflow. I also get bored really easily, so I'm always trying new plugins and trying new ways of doing things, because I like to keep learning new stuff. But on the back end, everything does need to be printed a certain way. So for me, it's using compressors, limiters, you know, stuff that I can sidechain so that my stems can easily match the final ref. And I try to keep my eyes open for stuff that's on the horizon, the demo, and check out how it works. But not too many grabbing, you know, not anything I can just say, use this and it's going to work every time. I definitely use different stuff all the time.
Yeah, and I think there's obviously different ways you can approach it. I sort of tend to start over from scratch if it's a mix project, especially on the record side. Like, until I hear what I'm working with, I don't know what I want to use. And I've seen other mixers on the record side have their template, they have their bus processing, and everything gets pumped through that. And in a way, that person's being hired because the person wants that mixer's sound in a way. And so you have to kind of understand what you're being hired for. You know, as a mixer, am I being hired because you like a certain sound that you heard me? They might even say, I love what you did on that record or that song. I want to capture that. So maybe in that case, you would kind of reference what you did before. Or, you know, some of these big name mixers, it's like, I need that sound for my, because it's also part of the way they're promoting their thing, so you have to know, it's like, are you looking for a certain sound that you heard me accomplish at one point, or am I helping you craft something new? And as a composer, I think you may be, composers, I'm trying to put my head in that space of, so many composers are asked to mix now, or need to out of necessity. And in that case, that may be more of something that you have your go-tos because it crafts a sound for you.
Yeah, good point.
So again, it depends on what the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. The music tells us.
Yeah.
The music tells us.
The music tells us. What are some pitfalls that composers can, what should we look out for when we know we're going to be working with mixer? I mean, I know we've already covered some of this earlier, like we need to have our files clean, we need to match our reference that we're sending, have our stems add up. Is a lot of time like file management that you get problems, like and anything you can tell us that I feel like save some issues or time or money, the way, should we just like checking ahead of time with like how to stem stuff, checking with the stage, like putting you in touch with them and how to deliver things, any last or thoughts about how you want to help us with our
I think
terrible organization?
The big one that comes to mind is, square one. I know not a lot of composers have an assistant, or they may not have consistently the same assistant. So just getting your workflow down. I know it's boring and no composer wants to stop and spend a whole day figuring out their stem printing workflow, but if you can invest that time, it just honestly pays back in return over the years. Checking your own personal composer template and how you're printing stems, double check them. Sometimes sessions get corrupted and you didn't notice that 5 cues ago. So just check your template. If you're constantly updating it, check your signal flow. If you're the type of composer that loves to split your reverb, your wet tracks versus your dry, double check how that's working out for you. And then if you do have an assistant, really drill into them the naming conventions, because it may seem really boring, but to us that saves us so much time that I'm embarrassed to say out loud how much time it takes us to fix that. And for a lot of mixers, our assistants are doing a workflow we taught them. So if someone drops the ball, it really puts a ripple effect. I think the biggest thing too, if you're a composer working with another composer, let's say some big time person calls you and you're doing, the buddy thing, don't be afraid to ask their assistant, because the composer's not going to tell you, because I used to be that assistant. Say, hey, what can I do to make your life easy? Because eventually you're going to be getting all of our files and you're going to funnel it to the scoring stage. Then you're going to funnel it to the music editor. Then you're going to funnel it to the mixer if I'm not the mixer. So really reach out to that composer assistant, connect with them, ask what naming conventions they're using, and ask how they're printing stuff as well. Because I find with the composers I work for that have hired additional writers, they get really bummed out if that additional writer isn't really getting on the train, because they feel that. Then they're wondering why their mixer's delayed and why they're not meeting it. And then they have to say, well, Dave over there, or, Sherry over there didn't follow a naming convention. And unfortunately, that could also put a damper on that composer calling you back. So these are the little things that seem little, but it means a lot to the greater team that's really just trying to get this to the finish line. The other thing is double checking.
Wait, can I ask you, the naming convention is just unique to whatever team you're working with. It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's unique to each team. I mean, we showed a screenshot earlier. That's not the average naming convention I've seen. But again, for the composer that maybe don't like their initials, I've worked with composers who don't want initials on stems for whatever political reason. So it's just really checking in, doing that check-in, that welcome email. I've never met a composer that doesn't like a welcome email from an additional writer that says, hey, you're so-and-so's assistant. give me the naming structure, give me the lowdown, what do I need to know so that I can adjust to you. Everyone appreciates that, and everyone finds out you did it, and everyone's really happy. You get like those brownie points that no one talks about. The other thing is, as boring as it sounds, your assistant really knowing to ref check before sending those files to the mixer.
Yeah.
Not checking the stems causes so much havoc, and it eats up, as we talked before, so much precious mix time, especially if you're on a tight deadline. Really check those stems, learn when stuff needs to be flagged, and learn when it really needs to be taken seriously that something's off. And then, I think those are the major ones when it comes to film score mixing. That really saves us time. And communicate. Don't be a ghost. I know some composers don't like a lot of communication, but just making that 5 minutes, even just to have a FaceTime with your mixer or your engineer, it really does. It's to help you out, right? It's to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Right. And you said, nobody wants to take a whole day to, change their routing and their template and their naming, whatever. Would you rather take that whole day before the project or in the middle of the project when the deadline's tomorrow? Because if you don't get it sorted out before, you're eventually gonna have to do it if there's a problem. And then everyone's gonna be stressed and everyone's gonna be on a deadline. And then another thing, so if reffing stuff, make sure that stuff has matches, but things happen, MIDI doesn't work properly. So there will be reprints that you will be asked for, like, oh, hey, I'm missing this stem, or hey, there was a pop in this stem, can you reprint that? Make sure when you resend it that is so clear that it's a reprint, which version it is. Do not send a file that the audio is different but the name is the same as the previous one. That could be
underscore RP or underscore reprint at the tail end. It really helps us out.
That stuff, you would be shocked at how much time gets lost trying to figure out, is this a reprint, is this replacing, which version is it for, is this, but it just, and that takes, especially if you're working with a mixer who doesn't have an assistant, that will take up so much of your mixer's time trying to figure out what is the right file. And then by the time they're mixing, they're exhausted because they've been tracking down files that aren't named properly. So don't do that.
Don't make the list.
I had a question. I kind of forgot to ask you. So what about mic positions? So if you get like a session and you're working, like say you did like a remote orchestra, and you decide to, first of all, you have to figure out what their mic names are. Hopefully they named it clearly, talk about file naming because you're working with a different studio. But say like you're doing your mix and like suddenly you hit this spot in a song or in a cue and you want to switch to a different mic. So do you tend to just pull that mic in, or do you switch the whole thing out? I mean, if you're mostly off the tree, do you just bring in the overhead? Is this making any sense?
Yeah, I think I'm hearing you correctly. You let's say you record a quartet or something, and then there's a part in the cue where you want to hear a little bit more of this person over the group.
Yeah, like say the performance didn't come through exactly how it should have, and like, yeah, exactly. A quartet is a great example, and we're off the tree because it's kind of bleeding together anyway, but then you want to pull this first violin in to get more of that sound. Like, how would you approach that situation?
Yeah, for me, hopefully there's the direct mics, there's close-up mics. So normally when I record any group of folks, there's different tiers of microphones. There's the close mics, there's the just overall group mics. That's like if I was taking a picture, it's like a slightly big wide lens, and then a little bit back there's a mid-room room mic. And I get excessive with the room mics just so I can also use that to secretly feed my reverb sometimes. They may not be audible in the mix, but they're feeding a reverb. Sometimes that helps me. Or if there's a loud pop, sometimes it's my saving grace. But for me, I guess, again, it's one of those things that's like, it depends on the music, but I guess I would immediately go to the direct mic, listen to it, and just sort of boost that guy up. So at least, your tree mics are supposed to be your core sound, right? That's the thing that you want really fill in your space. And then the direct mics are meant to really get that detail. So if you want more detail, it's normally the close-up mics. And a perfect situation. That's if it was recorded right, but yeah.
Can you talk about, I mean, I think you just touched on something really cool, like the kind of ghost reverb thing where you're sending the signal, but we're hearing the verb, but not the signal. Can you just briefly talk about that?
Yeah, I like to, again, I'm a former guitarist. Like my start in the audio industry was tinkering with guitar pedals and trying to also mimic sounds on the radio. I liked U2 and I liked Led Zeppelin and I liked Jimmy Page, and I was always trying to capture their sound with my really cheap gear. So I do a lot of the guitar pedal tweaking in my mixes as I would if I was playing guitar, and that's sort of what I play with too. So there was a composer who was writing a bunch of cool guitar bits for a really big movie about race cars. And the leading composer said, I like that cue, but is there any way that you can make a guitar sound like it's in the room, but not in the room? And he's like, crap. So he's huffing and puffing around campus. And finally I'm like, hey man, what's going on? Are you okay? He's like, I need your help. Like, this is what happened. I don't know what to do. I don't want to redo the performance. I honestly can't replay this again. I was in the moment. So I showed him about how to make his guitar a ghost. And that goes back to the pre-fader send that I'm talking about, where you can have a bus send on your track for the dry guitar, lower the dry guitar, swap your send to a pre-fader send, and send it to a reverb. Of course, we had a crap ton of EQs and compressors going on, but once he was able to play with the pre-fader send, I taught him how to use it. He was able to then do a new mix of his guitar work, and it slowly faded in and out of reality and then dream world. And I think that's an extreme version of it, but that's what I do too with some of the fake strings when I really want them to feel real and have that emotional impact, but I don't have any real strings to really lean on, or the real strings sound not ideal because I didn't record them. Then I lean into the samples a bit, or a combination of both, and I feed them kind of ghostly into a reverb and maybe a delay depending on the project, and I kind of fade them out so you don't really get the detail of some of the plasticiness of it, and you get more of a fake breathing room that I talk about. And sometimes if you EQ it right, the strings feel like they're above you. So sometimes that's an effect that some people like, that they could just kind of look up and the strings are there and it's still a stereo file. So
That's so cool. And do you pan them differently, or like are they pan the same way, or like they spread in like different areas? Or
that's a good question. It depends, really. It depends how much I want it to bloom. It really is me listening to, like Andrea was saying, the context of the song and seeing how far I want to. Sometimes I make the instrument narrow, not mono. You don't really want mono in film score. It's a really bad idea. So I kind of just leave it like phantom center sort of sometimes, or off to the left, off to right, depending on what instrument it is.
Is that like 11-1 phantom center?
Probably, yeah. And then, I mean, to me, a little bit there, and at least your ears aren't feeling like it's being pulled so much to the middle. And then the reverb, I might even automate to slowly pan out. Or sometimes, depending if I put the instrument on the far right side and the reverb kind of trails out this way. So it depends on really how weird I'm allowed to get with a piece of music. I definitely don't want to make it feel like I'm, rearranging anything or adding anything. I don't want to
flying around your head in Atmos. It's like,
turn on the blue lights, man. Turn on the blue lights.
Yeah. And that's something I've learned from so many mixers, like dial it back 20%, where you think it's good, pull back 20% before you send it to the composer. Because chances are you got a new plugin that day and you're just like, oh boy, let's crank this thing up.
Right.
It's like, oh, okay, I got to remember this isn't my music. This is a composer piece.
I think that I mean, I have to do that all the time. Dial it back to send to the director. It's true. It's like put it in, take a little bit off.
Self-control. Self-control, awareness.
Do we have any other questions, guys? Anyone? No questions? Any cool stories you guys want to share with us?
I don't know. I guess for me, it's like, I think there's something to be said to learn from the record world that people enjoy collaboration, you know, and on the record side of things, you know, there's no, I don't know, there's not a lot of walls up for people to kind of share projects and say, hey, come over, let's barbecue and fire up some coffee and listen to my stuff. You know what I mean? I think for a lot of bands, especially, collaboration is kind of how you keep yourself kind of just inspired. I think about a composer that I know who has jam sessions when he has writer's blocks. These jam sessions will last until like 1 a.m. And the next day he's back at it writing again with fresh perspective. And I think at the end of the day, art is still art, even if for some folks it can get a little bit more corporate-y than we'd like. I think at the end of the day, I think it's so cool to be on the record side of things, to see that collaborative nature. I'm not saying that on film score side there's not, obviously we wouldn't be having this, right? But I guess I really value that, and I love to see our film score you know, side of the planet to really join forces. And I love to hear what other composers are working on and hear their inspiration and tools they're using, because to me it inspires me to try new things, and just that osmosis effect, you know, of information sharing and jam sessions, you know. I'm curious how composers are in different pockets of the world are keeping up their inspiration, especially with so many people working from home. I know me as a mixer, I work in a cave, but then I meet, you know, folks, other mixers, and we just nerd out about stuff. And it's really nice to remember that. It's nice to remember you don't know everything. Everyone knows something you don't, and it keeps the train moving.
Yeah. Any cool stories, Andrea, that you want to share with us, or something?
I would echo kind of a similar thing that Laura was saying is, you know, you see a lot of crossover, people who've come from kind of the artist band side and then move into film scoring later, and because there's something I think that's really valuable about approaching music. And not that you can't be a fantastic film composer if you have never played in a band. That's not what I'm trying to say. But, you know, maybe if you identify with that and say, oh, I really have never played in a band, I don't like, maybe I only grew up playing in orchestras and I want to write, you know, maybe try to just open up your world of collaborating with people or meeting with people, and, you know, go to concerts that are completely different than anything that you know would go to normally, because you can get inspiration in all different kinds of ways. Because I've seen some of the people that I work for that have kind of transitioned over into film work, how much they pull on that, and you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you know their story. And like Laurie said, of seeing like, oh, these jam sessions, people from the outside might not know that's happening, you know. So don't be afraid to look for inspiration in different ways. And, you know, that goes also for, I think, collaborating with your engineer or with your mixer, you know, not just with other composers or with other musicians. Like you can pull so much inspiration from people working at different levels of, you know, this whole thing that we're all kind of a part of.
We're all floating in it.
We're all floating. We're just trying to figure out what am I doing in this whole sea of, you know, everyone's here because we love music, right?
Yeah.
And you can find inspiration for your craft or for your art or for whatever it is that you're doing with, you know, other people who are excited. And part of it is this kind of panel, which again, I'm so grateful that
we're
this
so
together.
grateful you guys came.
Yeah. And I think, you know, there's a lot to be said of, you know, spaces that feel safe. You know, I know I'll be honest, everything I do is through the lens of seeing how can I uplift women and minority, you know, communities that aren't represented in these types of spaces. You know, there's been times I've been in a recording session since I was 18 where I'm the only woman in the room. And to make matters worse, I'm the only person of color in the room. So everything that I do, everything that I work on, I'm always thinking about how can I pull someone else in, and just sharing this space, because there is a lot of work to be had. I don't like to think of things from a scarcity mindset. And I think it's more enjoyable to bring people along the way, you know, because it can only make our industry better. You know, when we think about AI, which I don't want to talk too much about, but there's a big fear around it, which is valid. But I think the more that I think it's an argument to be made that we should be coming together, sharing information, not being afraid to show our vulnerable pieces of music that we maybe don't want to show anyone, and just putting ourselves out there, because that's something, the human aspect of music, of creating, of art. You know, you can't really get away from that. The goosebumps you feel when you don't know someone and they're jamming out next to you, or I hear a mix that's just done so well, and I'm just like, man, I don't know who this person is, but this mix, I'm just soaking in it like a nice hot bath. You know, this is stuff that.
Yeah. Do
I
you
can,
hear mixes and like, are you like, for me, like I hear a piece of music and I'm dissecting what's in it. Like I try not to, like sometimes I forget and I'm like, oh, this is a really dope piece of music because I'm not thinking about what's in it. Like the
yeah,
same. Do you do that? Do you guys do that with mixes? Do you just like,
100%. I'm a
yeah.
huge fan of music. Like the record part of me is still there. I went to NAMM this year because Greg Penny was speaking. He's a mixer, and he did Elton John's Atmos mixes, and he didn't just throw an up mixer on it and call it a day, which a lot of the other albums are doing these days. Which there's nothing bad about it. It's just he went to the source. He spent, I think, 2+ years going through tape reels.
Whoa.
Is Elton recorded the tape. And he told me all this. I met with him in person. We had a one-on-one conversation because I'm like, I love your mix. Can we talk about it? And he was saying how he went through all the reel-to-reel tapes, had to transfer them into Pro Tools so that he can do a real, true upmix. Not just an upmix, but he remixed everything in Atmos. So if you have Tidal, which is another streaming service, and you are able to listen to an Atmos room or a sound bar, soak in that and being able to I talked to him for 2 hours. He was so generous with his time, and he was telling me about his process. And it's just, we're all still fans of the music that inspired us, I think. And we're all still, we're nerds. So okay to admit that.
Yeah. And I was just
Go
going to
ahead.
add that, like, I will, if it's like the goosebump check, for that. So it's like you can, especially if you're working on something and you're in the nitty gritty and then you step away from it, it's like if you listen back and try to kind of take away the analysis part of it, like, does it give you an emotional response? That,
Yeah.
I kind of maybe answering an earlier question, when something's done, of like,
There you go.
does it actually hit you emotionally in some way? But, and then also,
do you think
yes.
that has to do with like a sense of vulnerability? Like, because I feel like when we offer the world vulnerable art or something, then I feel like the world responds to it. Do you feel like that is the same in mixes? Because I think of we think of mixing as this like polish perfection, but there is a sense of vulnerability that comes through in some mixes,
Yeah, I mean, for me, I can feel emotionally drained after a mix, especially if for some composers, they ask me to put my own spin on some cues. They'll be like, I'll be honest with you, we could take this further and get more dreamier, especially with the more abstract hybrid scores. And I started off in live music. So I some of these pieces I mix like it's a live show in my mind. I throw the faders up and get going. But for some mixes, if it's really emotional content and the subject matter, I can get emotionally drained too, and I need to take breaks because it does take. I'm connected right there with the composer. I feel what they're trying to convey, and then even if they tell me a story about, that piece, it's some of us are right there with you. We're just showing our emotion through fader moves and EQ settings, but a lot of us were musicians at one point, so this is an extension of that nonverbal communication, right? So at least that's how I approach it.
And it's about like not being perfect though, right? Like it's
about 100%. My wife has a quote: practice makes progress, not perfection. And I love that.
I like that.
Yeah, because I think we've all heard overproduced songs as well that are technically perfect, if you will, and everything's lined up and everything, and it's like, okay. And then it might not hit you emotionally in any kind of way. And it's like, so that doesn't necessarily, and that's also, I think, part of getting external feedback along the creative process is you can lose perspective if you're trying to, I've seen, people producing and they're just overproducing, and it's like, well, we don't need it to be, we don't need all the vocals to be perfectly tuned, and because then you can really
100%.
lose the emotional content of that. So
I love that note.
Yeah, go ahead.
I love that because, again, there's conversation of AI, especially in the audio community. And for me, it's like, let's go back to the basics. The most beautiful albums in my mind, like 60s, 70s, early 80s, like there's iconic albums. And when you look, I'm that nerd that goes into like the music history of how they recorded it, what the backstory was, the band almost break up, and then that leads to that amazing guitar solo. And it's like some of these stories connect to, oh, we were just fooling around and that was actually a mistake. And it's like, as Bob Ross says, happy accidents. And I feel like, how do you mimic that when you want stuff to be so perfect? So there's something to be said, an argument to be made, that history has taught us that human error is kind of beautiful, and it makes us see things in a new way that maybe we wouldn't seen before. So I'm a fan. I know there's jokes when sometimes I've had to edit orchestra to match samples. They had the samples. I know that's a question before, and then we had the live orchestra. There's always that one person that's like, can we take out that noise? It's like, that's the sound of someone breathing.
Yeah.
That's someone breathing in between their
Right.
next note, and we should take that
Right.
out. Those are human beings in the room.
Yeah.
It's funny.
I learned in Let It Be, the Beatles,
Yeah.
there's no drums in the beginning. And that's because he was in the bathroom. He was in the bathroom, and he was such a fantastic musician that he was able to sneak in, sit on his stool, and just pop in at the right moment, and they kept it because it was perfect.
Good timing.
Yeah, but I think we're so out of time. Thank you, Connor, and thank you, Alexa, and thank you to the AWFC for letting us host this, and to you guys. My mind is spinning with all the information you gave us.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you to our great participants.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, for having us.
Yeah, great questions all around. And
and
anyone ever wants to grab coffee and hang out with us,
don't be afraid to reach out. I don't know if
they can mix.
Yeah.
don't be afraid to work together. Yeah,
reach out, nerd out with us, even if it's not to mix. I love nerding out with fellow creatives. It really, it's beautiful. So thank you.
All right, thank you guys.
Yes, thank you so much.
Bye.